Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
This episode is brought to you by Coffee Mate. Coffee Mate is the world's biggest coffee lover because we love all the ways you enjoy. Wait. Coffee Mate can't love coffee more than me. I'm a foodie. I went to Kyoto just for a nitro matcha latte. What? Oh, I have to finish the ad. Coffee Mate, for the love of coffee.
District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program. Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. It's the first Monday of fall 2024. I hope things are cooling down your way. Here in the Mid-Atlantic, we're enjoying some rain patterns and cooler conditions, which I'm very excited for. Over the weekend, you may have seen on social media, I went next door to North Carolina to go dove hunting, was quite successful. Those suckers are really hard to shoot. And the one that I did get, I executed the shot so perfectly. And I'm not saying this to be cruel and unusual, but someone who's been hunting for 7 years, almost going on 8 years, I'm glad that my accuracy and my wing shooting is improving. Of course, the bird did not die in vain. I'm going to be consuming it. And one person on Twitter took great offense to me gripping and grinning and posting about how the dove that I harvested and the dove that I brought back home with me from my new friend Taylor Moyer from LandTrust. We're going to have a story and interview to come on that very soon, hopefully in the next week or two, explaining what they do. We've had Nick from LandTrust, the founder, one of the co-founders, on before, but now I got to see the company in action through this property in North Carolina owned by Taylor and his wife, and how I was able to get my first ever dove and experience dove hunting for the first time. It'll all come full circle. Getting offended by dove hunting, you would think anti-hunters naturally would be very dismayed by grip and grins with deer, big game, some of the charismatic megafauna that they love to scream about but don't understand why they need to be managed, but to get simply outraged by a dove, yet you post about eating chicken. Who's the one with cognitive dissonance? Factory raised chicken is probably a lot more unhealthy for you than organic free range doves, but that just might be me. Some people just have a misunderstanding of how conservation is. You can put facts before them. I've done that before. I tried to educate this individual on that, and this was from someone who was claiming to be conservative and for freedom. So unfortunately, anti-hunting platitudes are also infecting people, not only on the center left, but even on the center right, which is very disconcerting to me. Regardless of how I feel politically, I hate that it's even creeping into people who supposedly politically think like me. So the education efforts have to continue. That's a summary of my dove hunt, but I want the bulk of this episode to largely focus on nuclear. We're going to pack nuclear updates in a really shorter format because you could go crazy with nuclear about the different facets of it. But I want to talk about several news items, 3 short stories in particular. They're all interwoven together. They all relate to each other. America, believe it or not, is finally getting serious about nuclear energy after all the misinformation, all the different perceptions and media portrayals of, again, terrible reactor disasters, some worse than others. But now because people are waking up to the fact that we need reliable baseload power, we need constant electricity, and we don't want to be shoring off energy that's created and wasting it and not storing it effectively, and we need stuff that runs, we need electricity generation that runs almost 100% of the time, nuclear is getting a second look, or a renewed look rather, from all different kinds of people, regulators, media influencers, energy experts, everyone, you're still going to face resistance from the radical environmentalists. They don't like nuclear. You'll never convince them because they're benefiting, let's be honest, profiting from solar and wind. That's their bread and butter. They're getting money through those interests. So supporting nuclear would cut at that interest group and would undermine their efforts. When people realize how utility scale solar and wind is not efficient, it destroys lots of land and really does not provide that baseload power, they're going to have an awakening and feel just like, why was I believing this when I could have supported something like nuclear? Nuclear benefits, I've highlighted them here on the program. Quickly, before I talk about the 3 important updates. Nuclear uses the least amount of land of any energy facility. If you don't believe me, I've attached a graphic to the show notes. For a 1,000 megawatt facility, nuclear only requires 1 square mile of land. You contrast that with a comparable solar or wind facility, it's going to shock you how much land is used for those 2 alternatives that the government is double downing on. Even some in the private sector are double downing on. But this graphic from the Visual Capitalist, which took information from both the Department of Energy and Nuclear Energy Institute, because they've stated this, but I've never seen a concrete graphic until this. I'm so glad I found the original source. Visual Capitalist, Smashing Atoms, the History of Uranium and Nuclear Power. So to see this contextualized for yourself, this, again, 1 square mile of land for 1 typical nuclear reactor producing 1 gigawatt of electricity, or 1,000 megawatts of electricity. Comparable to that, you need 360 times more land for accommodating 431 utility scale wind turbines to produce the same amount of energy. And when you think about environmental footprint, that sounds scary. Now, what does it take? How much more land comparable to 1 reactor would it take for photovoltaic solar panels? Okay, so you need 75 times more land than nuclear to put 1.3 million photovoltaic solar panels to produce the same amount of energy 1 reactor produces. So to me, that seems like an environmental win. You are concerned about impact from land, impact to the environment, impact to wildlife habitat, what have you. Nuclear just seems to be, of any clean energy source, practical and realistic and actually environmentally friendly, if we're being honest. And in terms of the capabilities of nuclear, it runs almost 24/7. It has a 93% capacity factor, meaning it runs 93% of the time of the year across 365 days. The electricity is virtually carbon-free, if you're concerned about that. And I will caveat the discussion of these updates with saying, I don't really think you should latch nuclear onto net zero, which is what some people are doing. Some people who support net zero don't think nuclear should be part of the equation. Some people are like, let's find a middle road and say, yes, this is our way to achieve it. I don't want to support that cop-out. I don't support that cop-out. I like nuclear energy in spite of net zero directives because, again, if you're pushing for net zero and you want all these different sources to occupy the grid, you're canceling out reliable power with unreliable power. You're substituting reliable power with unreliable. It makes no sense, logical sense whatsoever when you hear people like, let's stack the whole grid with all of this. And it's like the grid cannot handle intermittent sources. Like that's why we're seeing tech companies, which we'll talk about shortly, pivoting to nuclear because they understand, and even natural gas, because solar and wind are very intermittent. They have a low capacity factor. Again, this question of how much land is going to be gobbled up to generate even some semblance, if you're lucky, let's say, of a comparable nuclear reactor. I want to go back a little bit from earlier this month, a Department of Energy report. You should read the report for yourself. I'm still digesting it. But interestingly enough, the Office of Nuclear Energy, going back to why nuclear is so hot right now, especially this month, they found that 60 gigawatts of new nuclear capacity could be built at existing nuclear power plants. Why were we shutting down nuclear power plants to begin with? Why were we decommissioning them? San Onofre, where I grew up, basically shut down almost 10 years ago over some incident. 3 Mile Island, which we'll talk about shortly, was shut down permanently 5 years ago. And on the 5th anniversary, there was a deal announced just last week that they're going to be restarting the plant for AI data centers. And so now this administration is coming to, or I think rather the government is coming to the conclusion, much like people were in the private sector and in this energy space, that more nuclear power can be shored up on new power plants or recently retired, or rather operating or recently retired. And the Department of Energy says this additional nuclear capacity could increase access to clean, firm, reliable, resilient energy while putting our nation on a path to achieve the Biden-Harris administration's goal of a net zero economy by 2050. Again, this sticking point makes no sense when you understand and learn that you need to have reliable baseload, abundant power, not intermittent, feel-good, nice-sounding solar and wind, which can't compete with nuclear whatsoever. But it's just the federal spending we see from the IRA and all these other packages coming from Congress that are artificially favoring these technologies, so to speak, in these facilities, yet we see that they're not immune to shocks in the market. You see SunPower, which is a rooftop solar provider, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy this summer. Last year, offshore wind nearly collapsed, lost 60% of market value in the stock exchange. Clean energy is not doing so hot. EVs, nobody wants them. There's no consumer demand for them whatsoever. It was exaggerated. And even if you construct publicly funded charging stations, that's not an incentive for people to buy, especially from the government, to buy EVs. It's not happening in the private sector. You really think force of government creating a so-called availability of more charging stations when they're already available privately, nobody wants to use them. You really think it's going to incentivize people when it's done publicly through government spending, Secretary Buttigieg? Not so fast. So this whole notion that solar and wind are clean energy technologies that are being favored in the market that consumers want is increasingly false when you contrast that with nuclear and how much people are excited about nuclear and see its potential. And nuclear is not a new technology either. We were actually a leader in nuclear, and then 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, which was a Soviet failure, not a nuclear energy failure, and Fukushima and some others really did it in for nuclear. But there's an interest, a renewed interest, which is why the Department of Energy published this, because China and Russia are eating our lunch. They're building, I don't know how many fold more nuclear plants, coal plants, oil and gas plants too, but especially nuclear. Our enemies are building them faster than we are, and we're arguing over semantics of going, we have to go net zero, we have to do this, when you could be focusing on actually harnessing clean energy, supplementing conventional energy, which largely powers our grid. 83% of our current electric grid by energy that's consumed, comes from coal, oil, natural gas. Nuclear also provides 9% of that as well, in addition to that. So 91% of power comes from coal, oil, natural gas, and nuclear in this country. Renewables are at a paltry 9%, even with this insistence of transitioning away from fossil fuels. It doesn't have staying power in the grand scheme of things. And so, again, I don't like caveating nuclear with net zero. It's flawed. It will undermine nuclear. If we've seen what net zero insistence and pushing does for solar and wind, it hampers it from ever coming online. I don't want nuclear to fall into that. That's just me. But in the evaluation of nuclear power plant, coal power plant sites for new nuclear capacity, report evaluated 54 operating and 11 recently retired nuclear power plants across 31 states. They were reviewed for factors such as availability of adequate cooling water, proximity to large population centers or hazardous facilities, or unacceptable seismic or flood hazards. Early research shows 41 operating and retired nuclear power plants sites have room to host new reactors. And this comes after Vogtle Unit 3 and 4 came online recently. So I applaud that. Again, I don't think it should be caveated with net zero. Let it be unleashed in the market. Government has to get out of the way. We need permitting reform. And then you can get this 60 gigawatts of new nuclear capacity to be built, because red tape, lack of permitting reform, and this debate over semantics and what interests will be fulfilled if it's tied to the government or if we just solely have it developed with subsidies. Subsidies doom new energy projects, especially ones like nuclear, from ever coming online. Let's talk about 3 Mile Island. So 3 Mile Island had an incident in 1979 before I think a lot of us were born. I was born in the early 1990s. I remember hearing about this in school when I had environmental courses, and they said it was a horrible disaster, terrible, terrible, terrible. 5 years ago, it was permanently shuttered. But last week, it was announced that Microsoft had landed a deal with 3 Mile Island nuclear reactor's owner, Constellation Energy, to restart the reactor for a 20-year agreement. And the deal is very fascinating. So according to Reuters, Constellation Energy and Microsoft have signed a new power deal to resurrect a unit of 3 Mile Island nuclear plant in Pennsylvania in what would be the first ever restart of its kind. According to the report last Friday, key regulatory permits for the plant's new life, however, haven't been filed, regulators say. This is due to, as you all know, the increased interest in having AI-powered data centers. So again, kind of like stipulating nuclear development with net zero, I don't think nuclear should only just be used for data centers. I think it should be used for all type of baseload power, not just data centers. That's just my thinking. I don't want it to become monopolized just for one sector. It should be available to all. That's usually how energy works, not just preferred by certain industries, because if they're doing this to get like IRA money in the hopes that they can benefit exclusively from it, cornering people out of the market, not really opening it up to market innovation, that worries me. But if it is truly kept in the private sector with few strings attached from the government or not so much in subsidies, I think we could celebrate this, of course. Nuclear energy, which is nearly carbon-free and broadly considered more reliable than solar and wind, has become a popular option for technology companies with uninterrupted power needs and climate pledges. Again, the climate pledge makes no sense. It'll undermine nuclear energy's capabilities. Like, stop caveating it by that. That's what they're doing because they don't want to anger people. They want to say, oh, we're climate friendly. So again, just stop caveating it. Just say abundant energy. You don't need to say net zero. And the Constellation Chief Executive Officer, Joe Dominguez, said nuclear plants are the only energy sources that can constantly deliver on that promise. Power from the plant would be used to offset Microsoft's data center electricity use, the company said. And what friends of mine from Pennsylvania had said that the plant had become encumbered by subsidies and other problems, which led to its closure. And the deal also says that it would help enable revive Unit 1 of the 5 decades old facility that was retired in 2019 due to economic reasons. Unit 2, which had the meltdown, would not be restarted. But oddly enough, this incident didn't lead to one single death. That's what I think a lot of the coverage obfuscates. Constellation plans to spend about $1.6 billion to revive the plant, which it expects to come online by 2028. And again, it's a 20-year lease agreement from my understanding. And under the deal, Microsoft will purchase energy from the restarted plant for a period of 20 years. 3 Mile Island unit will provide 853 megawatts of electricity, or enough to power about 700,000 homes. That's a lot more than offshore wind, solar. Very impressive. A restart is expected to be challenging, but as power demand spikes, the virtually carbon-free electricity source is seeing renewed support from tech companies and the wider American public. Nuclear supplied almost 19% of electricity generation across the U.S. last year, so it is going to definitely get a boost. We saw a bill passed by Congress, a pretty overwhelming bipartisan majority landed to President Biden's desk to reform the NRC, which is the governing body over nuclear energy technology. So then now we need to couple that with permitting reform. Hopefully we do. One nuclear proponent that I started to follow, Mark Nelson, who goes by Energy Bants, he calls this Microsoft data center deal blockbuster in terms of resurrecting 3 Mile Island. They've agreed to a massive, unprecedented deal to restart the closed 3 Mile Island reactor by 2028 to power its data centers. The deal, Microsoft purchasing as much power as possible from its 880 megawatt reactor over 20 years for prices rumored to be above $100 per megawatt hour. And he also describes such as, you would think, however big you think the Microsoft deal is, I'm telling you it's bigger. One of the biggest power deals ever. $800 million a year for 20 years, $16 billion for one reactor from a 40-year-old reactor just to get to the age of 60. We now have a market for new build. I tend to agree with that assessment. So follow Mark for more nuclear insights, and he might join the podcast in the near future too. I think we've been in talks to have him on the program. I've been chatting with him. He has a kid on the way. I have a busy schedule too, so maybe in October we will hear from Mark directly on the podcast. And a story that broke today because of this renewed interest in nuclear from this government report, from this 3 Mile Island announcement. Apparently, the big banks want to shore up nuclear energy too. This is really fascinating ahead of, I guess, some UN climate event happening in New York this week. But I saw this and I was like, I need to talk about this too in terms of the financial interest in this, where the markets, like I said, I think could reward nuclear energy when everyone sees the benefits for itself, understands that there are so many shortcomings with solar and wind, which is where everyone has been going. And the big banks, which are, funny enough, ESG proponents who are pushing net zero, say that they want to now harness nuclear, again, caveating it with and conceding that, it's to fulfill net zero climate aims. I hope more of them start to shed that. And I think they are. A couple companies are, when they realize it's impractical to pursue such a goal, because you're not going to reduce, by all accounts, 1.5 degrees Celsius at best if you are to do a Green New Deal-like plan, which is terrible policy-wise, regulation-wise. You're only going to reduce temperatures at best 0.2 degrees Celsius while destroying the economy. So no measurable impact benefit to the environment. And then you have untold economic destruction. So that is what you are supporting when you support net zero, with this thinking that you're going to reduce temperatures. And you reject this abundance notion that our pal Andre talked about from the Commonwealth Foundation recently here on the podcast. All right, from Fortune magazine, here is the headline. 14 of the world's biggest banks and financial institutions are pledging to increase their support for nuclear energy, a move that governments and the industry will hope unlock more finance for a new wave of nuclear power plants. An aside, I think this is where they should actually be channeling their efforts instead of depressing the oil and gas investment landscape. They should be putting their money behind actually viable technologies and projects such as nuclear. So kudos to them. But again, they're trying to do this in line with the UN, with net zero. That's a fallacy. And that's a problem they're going to fall into. And I think they're going to be abandoning that language very soon, because that's just where things are going. People see that net zero is impractical and unsustainable all across the board. So that's my hesitation. If they're embracing it because of net zero, are they truly understanding why nuclear is great? Net zero, not so great. At an event on Monday in New York with John Podesta, the White House climate policy advisor, I think he took over for John Kerry, institutions including Bank of America, Barclays, BNP Paribas, Citi, Morgan Stanley, and Goldman Sachs say they will support a goal first set out in the COP28 climate negotiations last year to triple the world's nuclear energy capacity by 2050. They will not spell out exactly what they would do, but nuclear experts said the public show of support was a long-awaited recognition that the sector had a critical role to play in the transition to low-carbon energy. The difficulty and high cost of financing nuclear projects has been an obstacle to new plants and contributed to the significant slowdown in Western countries since the wave of reactors was built in the 70s and 80s. Banks could also support new plants by increasing direct lending and project finance to nuclear companies, arranging bond sales, or introducing companies to private equity or credit funds. Financial institutions have long been divided on nuclear energy because of the complexities of project financing and high level of risk, but also because of questions about whether it complies with organizational ESG standards. There you go. See, I am onto something here. I don't want to toot my own horn, but ESG, net zero, and nuclear, they're not going to be working in concert with one another, because, again, nuclear dominates the competition. It dominates solar and wind. Maybe down the road, nuclear will replace fossil fuels, but I'm not of that mindset where I want to trade reliable baseload power, what we have now, primarily coal, oil, and gas, for nuclear entirely, because we can't do that currently. But in the future, let's say a great substitute potentially could be nuclear. But I'm not of the mindset of having to trade what works for an aspirational goal. But see, there we go. ESG proponents are not going to like nuclear because they think it's environmentally insensitive and environmentally problematic. So this is why people have to be very careful lumping nuclear with net zero. The World Bank and other multilateral institutions do not provide any finance to nuclear projects. There you go. BNP told the Financial Times that there was no scenario in which the world could hit carbon neutrality by 2050 without nuclear power, citing the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Barclays said it saw a role for nuclear as a solution to the intermittency of wind and solar. The Financial Times article continues to say that most of the world's nuclear power plants have been built in Asia and the Middle East, led by China. See? We shouldn't be having to play defense, but we are. Better late than never, I guess. But governments in developed countries have started to argue that nuclear energy can be a solution to their net zero commitments, and the US, UK, Japan, Sweden, and United Arab Emirates were among those that signed onto the COP28 commitment to triple capacity. Nuclear energy has also started to gain support from big tech, which sees it as one low-carbon solution to powering data centers. On Friday, Microsoft announced, of course, the plan to restart 3 Mile Island. And the Financial Times article rounds up that there still is hesitancy among banks to bankroll nuclear energy projects. Participating banks sent non-binding commitments on nuclear energy to private sector partners, according to one person familiar with the announcement, but multiple banks declined to comment ahead of the event, underscoring the sensitivity even as public opinion on nuclear in the US and Europe has become more favorable. And it is true, there is rising support across partisan lines, a little bit behind on gender lines. We got to work on ladies, and I'm trying to do that in my capacity at IWF and here on the podcast. But the ones that have expressed clear support for nuclear are Abu Dhabi Commercial Bank, Ares Management, Brookfield Credit Agricole CIB, Guggenheim Securities, Rothschild & Co., Seger Capital Management, and Societe Generale. If you want to read more about that and every other kind of derivative relating to this fascinating news cycle on nuclear, this positive news cycle, news for nuclear rather, I have everything in the show notes. Please be sure to follow that and let me know what you think about nuclear. I think nuclear is exciting. I don't want it to get bogged down by red tape. Net zero is going to complicate things. And again, this is why these tech companies are switching from betting on solar and wind to power data centers to natural gas and nuclear, because they see that net zero is untangling before their very eyes. Like, we have to convince people and make the case to have them move away from this net zero pledge. Like, if you go by arbitrary deadlines, which will likely never be met, you will never harness enough energy, needed to meet this increased electricity demand. It's going to be 9% increase in electricity demand because of all these different projects by 2028, when Constellation plans to reopen 3 Mile Island. Funny target. And then if you don't meet this critical electricity demand, you're going to see electricity bills rise 20%. So people recognize you need reliable baseload power. That includes natural gas, nuclear. Net zero, to be honest and frank with you all, is at odds with energy security and this notion of having reliable baseload power, because even its proponents admit that the sources that they've been banking on cannot power grids, they cannot power data centers, they can't provide cheap, reliable, affordable, portable electricity. So I think the net zero tie-in to nuclear is going to similarly dissipate too, because people have to stop thinking in this lens. Think about abundance. Energy abundance is not a scary phenomenon. It doesn't lead to despoiling of the environment. Having lots of plentiful, domestically harnessed and produced energy is good, because when the economy is thriving, when you have these projects, people will start to care about their surroundings, not having to worry about scarcity, not having to worry about blackouts, brownouts. Americans are understanding slowly but surely that nuclear is actually environmentally friendly, it's actually reliable, and when unleashed by the markets, probably will lead to cheaper energy prices. I'm excited by this. I'll have some write-ups at IWF and Town Hall in the future. I hope you're excited by nuclear too. And if you have questions and concerns about nuclear, show notes have all the resources to explain what are the benefits, potentially some drawbacks, but there are more benefits and pros than cons. If it's overwhelming for you, I'm here to hold your hand, metaphorically speaking, to help you navigate this understanding of why people are banking on nuclear, why people are betting on nuclear. It's a really cool project, is a really cool industry, and the more you learn about it, I think the more you will shed any misconceptions you have about it. Tell me if you're excited by nuclear too. I would love to hear your feedback. If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.